Ever find yourself wondering, like, after a long gaming session, if all those hours we spend in virtual worlds, you know, battling dragons or racing cars or whatever you're into, if it secretly kind of changes us?
Yeah.
I mean, we've all heard the concerns about violent video games, right?
Right.
Do they really make teens more aggressive, less empathetic, all that? It's a debate that's been going on forever.
Yeah, it feels like it.
But today, we're diving into some serious science to try and get some real answers.
Yeah, we're looking at this huge study straight out of Missouri University.
And they did not mess around.
No, they tracked over 3,000 teenagers.
Check teenagers, to be exact.
For years.
Years. Okay, so full disclosure before we hit start on this deep dive. I got to admit, I was totally ready to hear about how all those virtual explosions were going to equal, like, real-world mayhem, you know?
Of course, yeah.
But, spoiler alert, the findings are way more interesting than that, so buckle up.
It's true. This study really makes you rethink those classic assumptions we have about video games and aggression. But before we get to the results, maybe we should back up a bit.
Yeah, lay the groundwork.
Video games are everywhere,
Yeah.
right? We're talking billions of players globally.
Yeah, it's like a 247 global gaming tournament happening right now.
Exactly. But of course, it's the violent video games that stir up the controversy, right? Or VVGs, as the researchers call them.
VVGs, kitschy. So what makes this particular study so insightful? Why should we care what these Czech researchers have to say?
Well, remember I said they followed these same teenagers over years? That's what makes this study so powerful. It's longitudinal. You get to see how behaviors and attitudes change over time with the same individuals. We're not just comparing, one group of kids to another at a single point in time.
Right.
It's about individual journeys over years.
So we can maybe finally answer that chicken or the egg question, at least when it comes to video games and aggression.
Exactly. And it gets even better. They didn't just measure aggression broadly either. They dug into different types of aggression.
Oh, interesting. Like what?
So they look at physical aggression, think pushing, shoving, actual physical fights.
Okay, real world stuff.
And they looked at verbal aggression, insults, threats, that sort of thing.
Which, let's be real, a heated argument in, like, a chat room hits different than a playground brawl.
Right. Exactly. And they didn't stop there. They also looked at two specific types of empathy, affective and cognitive.
Okay, I got to be honest, my brain always trips up on those two. Empathy is empathy, right?
Well, it's more nuanced than you might think. So affective empathy, that's that almost instinctive emotional mirroring. Like if you see someone crying and you start to tear up, that's affective empathy in action.
Oh, okay. So you're feeling those feelings right along with them. Gotcha.
Exactly. Then there's cognitive empathy. That's more about understanding someone else's perspective. Even if you don't necessarily feel their emotions as your own.
Interesting. So you can get why someone's upset, even if you're not, like, personally swept up in it.
Precisely. And these nuances, as we'll see, they're really crucial for understanding what this study found.
Okay, you've officially got my attention. Hit me with the results.
All right, ready for this. They found that teens who were, generally more aggressive at the start of the study, they did tend to play more of those violent video games.
Yeah, that's not super surprising, right? Seems kind of intuitive.
Right, like kids who are more prone to, getting into it in the real world are probably more into virtual brawls too.
Exactly. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the games cause them to be more aggressive.
Right, exactly. That's the big thing. It could just be that that's just the kind of entertainment they're drawn to because of their personality. Correlation, not necessarily causation.
Ah, yes, the classic correlation causation trap. Always got to watch out for that one. But wait, didn't you say something about, like, empathetic kids being drawn to these games too? That's where I'm having trouble wrapping my brain around it.
Yeah. Right. It does seem kind of counterintuitive.
Yeah.
So they found that teens who scored higher on cognitive empathy, remember, that ability to understand other people's perspectives, they were also more likely to play VVGs.
So are we saying there's a sensitive soul hiding behind every, like, battle-hardened avatar?
Yeah.
How do they explain that?
Well, it might not be as strange as it sounds. Think about it. A lot of these games, even the really violent ones, they often have pretty complex storylines, characters with their own backstories and motivations and all that.
Right.
And to really get into those stories, to understand why a character might be making certain choices, even if those choices involve, blowing stuff up.
You need to be able to put yourself in their shoes a bit. It's like,
Yeah.
I can enjoy a good action movie, but if I don't get why the hero is on a rampage, the whole thing just falls apart.
Exactly. It's about understanding those motivations, the consequences, even if it's all, happening in a fictional world.
Okay, I'm starting to see how that tracks. But hold on. This is all still correlations, right? Like, kids who are already a certain way being drawn to certain games. Did the study actually show that playing more violent video games actually leads to changes in aggression or empathy over time?
Yeah.
That's what we really want to know.
You're right, and that is where this study gets really interesting because, remember, it's longitudinal. They followed these teens for years, which means they could analyze what's called within-person effects.
With in-person effects.
Yeah, basically, how did each individual teenager change over time? And did changes in their gaming habits line up with those changes?
Okay, so cut to the chase. Did all those virtual battles turn into real-life brawls? Did blasting zombies turn these kids into, like, unfeeling robots? What did they find?
Get this. Playing more violent video games did not make these kids more aggressive over time. That whole desensitization hypothesis, the idea that, like, exposure to violence in video games makes you numb to violence in real life, yeah, this study just did not support that.
Wow. Okay, color me surprised. So no matter how many headshots these kids racked up in, like Call of Duty or whatever, it didn't make them any more likely to, like, start a fight in the real world.
That seems to be the case, yeah. And before you ask, it didn't work the other way around either. Becoming more aggressive in real life didn't mean they suddenly started playing more violent games.
Okay, double shocker. So what about the flip side? Empathy. Did all that time immersed in these, digital combat zones make these kids any less in tune with other people's feelings?
Nope. And this is just as important. There was no evidence that playing more of these games made teens any less empathetic over time.
So we're really upending the traditional narrative here. But I gotta admit, I'm starting to wonder if there's any connection at all. I mean, this whole debate exists for a reason, right?
Yeah, it's definitely not as simple as we thought, right? I mean, the study can't just, like, completely debunk everything we thought we knew, right? Well, you're right. It's not like the researchers came up empty-handed. They did find some interesting stuff, especially when they looked specifically at physical aggression.
Okay, so there were some virtual punches turning into real-world punches then. What'd they find?
It's tricky. Remember we were talking about within-person effects? How each person changed over time.
Yeah, the whole point of the study, right.
Right. So playing more violent games overall didn't mean a kid was definitely going to get more aggressive, but changes in those two things did seem connected, but, like, in both directions.
Both directions. You mean, like, sometimes more aggression in real life meant more violent gaming, but sometimes it meant less? That's confusing.
It is strange, right? And the researchers actually think that, they think COVID might have been a factor there.
Oh, right, because adding a global pandemic to the mix always makes things less complicated.
Yeah, exactly. Think back to those early lockdown days when, like, everyone was stuck at home, glued to their screens. It was a weird time, super stressful, isolating. And since they were collecting data right when the pandemic hit, the researchers think it could skew the results a bit.
Yeah, I mean, trying to make sense of teen behavior is hard enough without a global crisis going on. But didn't this study also look at teens of different ages? Were there any differences there?
Yeah, you'd assume age would be a big factor, right? But surprisingly, it didn't seem to matter that much when it came to who played violent games. Boys played more than girls, which, isn't shocking, but the age thing wasn't as clear-cut as you might expect.
So much for those age ratings, huh?
Yeah.
Maybe parents aren't, like, monitoring screen time as closely as they think. Or maybe it's just really hard to control what kids see and do online these days.
Yeah, it's a good point, but I think the bigger takeaway here, the thing that really challenges our assumptions is that, the relationship between these games and aggression and even empathy is way more complex than we usually think. It's not as easy as play a violent game, become more aggressive.
So no more blaming every schoolyard scuffle on Grand Theft Auto.
Exactly. There are other things going on, Their personalities, their friends, their families, what's happening in the world around them. And honestly, that's kind of hopeful.
Hopeful? How so?
Because it means we might actually be able to do something about it. If it's not just about banning or hiding these games, then maybe it's about focusing on those other things. Teaching kids better social and emotional skills, building stronger communities, making sure kids feel supported and heard.
Okay, I see what you mean. It's about looking at the bigger picture, right?
Yeah.
Instead of just focusing on one thing, we got to understand the context. Maybe these games are filling a need, whether it's connection or a feeling of accomplishment, or even just an escape from everything else going on.
Exactly. That's what I love about this kind of research. It doesn't give us all the answers, but it makes us ask better questions. It pushes us to think differently.
To be more curious and less afraid of, like, the digital world.
Yeah.
Well, that's about all the time we have for this deep dive. But as always, the conversation doesn't end here. Keep those questions coming. Stay curious. And maybe, just maybe, you'll discover something new about yourself in the games we love to play. Until next time.